was at hand. In the last days of June 1943, thousands of Canadian troops, men of the 1st Canadian Division, set sail in 2 enormous convoys to a destination as yet unknown. 3 years of battle-minded training, months of careful planning, intense organization. Men, machines, and material were going into history with this convoy.
One thing sure, this floating camp's heading for 0 hour, somewhere south. This is no training scheme, not when they hand out tropical kits and light uniforms. They don't let you rust aboard ship. There's plenty to keep you busy. Periods in semaphore, aircraft recognition, and what's a soldier's life without washing and cleaning up? And, of course, some deep thinking. The Navy's on the job, all right. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, corvettes. You get a feeling nothing can happen with all that stuff around. Ready to pace the U-boats to kingdom come. Blow the Jerry pilots into the drink.
It wasn't until the convoy had passed Gibraltar on the non-stop trip from Scotland that the troops were told where they were going.
Sicily. After 3 years, our first real chance. We can forget all that grousing and squawking. We're going to know our geography in a way we never learned in school. We're going to make the most of it. Every job begins to mean something more. Getting our kit together, filling grenades, dabbing a bit more oil on the rifle, checking and double-checking, writing that extra letter home to the folks, the girlfriend. Knowing where you're going makes a difference. It's not training anymore.
From Tunis, Bizerta, Sousse, a tremendous convoy joined with the Canadians. Over 3,000 vessels under a canopy of air power aimed their prows at Sicily, cockpit of history. Throughout the entire 2,000-mile trip, the weather favored the convoy. As 0 hour approached, a storm of gale proportions blew up. Landing craft could not work in that sea. If it continued, operations might prove too risky, have to be postponed. Commander-in-Chief of Allied Naval Forces in the Mediterranean made his decision.
We are about to embark on the most momentous enterprise of the war, striking for the first time at the enemy in his own land.
The big show was on. Allied invasion craft sped to 7 landing points along 100 miles of coastline. Allied guns blasted at 0 hour.
This is it. D-Day, the day of landing. The Navy and Air Force have done their job getting us here. Now it's our job to stay. We're nervous. Some of us are seasick. Outside of that, it's just like a training scheme back in England. There's some machine gun fire, but we're ready for anything they can throw at us.
Mare Nostrum, our sea. No longer the sea of the fascists, now the sea of the men of the United Nations. By dawn, the very lights, signals of Allied success, flared skyward as the assault waves stormed their first objective. Canadian soldiers had gone through the beach defenses in a matter of minutes. Men from the far west, the maritime east, the wheat fields and the prairies, the farms and factories, the mines and lumber camps, ready to prove that battle was their business. 100 miles of invasion coastline jammed with Allied troops made perfect targets for enemy bomb sites.
Get those tanks and carriers ashore. The Yak-X on the job.
As the naval and air forces crumbled the coastal defenses of the Axis, Canadians, British, and Americans kept surging onto the beaches. 14,000 vehicles, 600 tanks, 1,800 guns, 160,000 men. Every branch of the service worked together as a team, unloading weapons and supplies and smashing the enemy. General Montgomery, impressed with Canadian battle efficiency, greeted the troops, telling them they were terrific, first-rate fighters. With Allied beachheads established, the Americans struck westward, the British northward, and the Canadians were set to drive a spearhead into the center towards Enna, the Axis headquarters. That first week, the infantry captured many towns. An unending torrent of tanks was grinding its way to the heart of Sicily. Axis resistance was weak. The real enemy was heat. The men were eating their own dust all the way. Among the first to distinguish themselves were the Royal Canadian Regiment, the Loyal Edmontons, the Three Rivers Tank Regiment, the Princess Pats, the Seaforths, the Vandoos, the Hastings and Prince Edwards, the 48 Highlanders. The Canadians were moving on and fast. After a stiff fight on the plains and hills near Piazza Armerina, the infantrymen were proving the training. The town fell to an attack led by the Loyal Edmontons. In 7 days, the Allied advance had occupied 1/4 of all Sicily. The Axis moved its headquarters from Enna to Randazzo.
In the first week, we nabbed our first fascist general. General Dave looked well fed, but had no stomach for real fighting. But the Italian soldiers act happy. There's thousands of them anxious to surrender. It don't look to me like their hearts are in it, fighting for Il Duce and the Nazis. But this show hasn't been a picnic. The enemy doesn't give up as easily everywhere. We put the Nazis where they belong. Some of our boys got it too. That only makes us want to get on with the job of wiping out the Nazis and their fascist pals. We've got a score to settle all over the world. We check our equipment every spare minute. Repair it. Every piece. You can't trust a lot. The old saying, a soldier's as good as his weapon, makes a lot more sense out here.
Don't worry, soldier. That equipment was built to last. There's thousands of us men and women back here in Canada, keeping our eyes glued to the gun sites of production, making sure you get the goods. Working the clock round. Turning out the Valentines, the Rams, the M4s for you. 300 plants clear across Canada turning out ammunition. 86 yards building ships for the Navy. We've turned out our 10,000th plane. Your battle line begins right here at our lathes and drill presses. 35,000 rifles. 8,000 Bren guns every month, 10,000 tons of explosives, 25 million rounds of ammunition every week. We've got the biggest Bren gun carrier plant in the world. We're turning out everything that rolls and shoots on wheels for you. And we're buying the victory bonds to help pay for it. This is our war, yours and mine, and we'll win it together.
The second week saw the Americans subdue the western half of the island, while the British drove northward to the approaches of Catania. The Canadians, with the Americans on their left, began their march on Enna. On the hills south of Enna, the Royal 22nd, West Novas, and Carleton and York smashed the Germans. The Nazis, veterans of years of fighting, were learning to fear the red patch devils of the 1st Division, veterans of 2 weeks fighting. Meanwhile, the 2nd Brigade pushed on to Leonforte. With the Seaforths and Edmontons preparing the way, and supported by tanks and artillery, the Princess Pats stormed the town. The limestone skeletons of towns, the booby traps, the littered equipment, the smashed tanks, all mute testimony to the bitter retreat of the enemy. With the capture of Leonforte, plans were already being mapped by Generals Montgomery and Simmons to crush Adjira. Meanwhile, the men took a well-earned rest.
First thing we do after a fight is get off our feet and lie in the shade, if there is any shade, and take it easy. Some of us haven't slept for 3 days. Our first bath only took off the top layer of dust. This country is lousy with fruit, but the heat here is enough to fry a chicken. Jokes aside, the food we get is swell, and lots of it. Got to credit the Army Service Corps for feeding us. The first few days we were too nervous to eat for the fighting. Now the cook says we're real vets. He just can't feed us enough.
You boys overseas can count on the farm folk of Canada. Producing food for you is a big enough job. But there's millions of other folk who've got to be fed too, at home and in other countries. But we're learning to work with our neighbors, putting in extra hours, learning to share our machinery, planting new crops for war. We have to produce more beef this year, and more sheep for their wool and meat. And more hogs for bacon and pork. I used to grumble about getting up at 5. Even the youngsters doing a man's job, and that goes for the women folk too. Still, there ain't enough help. Sometimes a man's got to do 150 acres by himself. But with everybody pitching in, yeah, and buying victory bonds, we'll come through. You can count on us.
More than two-thirds of Sicily now lay in Allied hands. To the Canadians fell the task of overcoming the Nazi mountain stronghold, Adjira. Prior to that, Asolo had fallen to the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment, which clawed its way up a 2,500-foot precipice to capture the town. Desoria, scene of some of the bloodiest fighting of the whole campaign, was taken in a combined action of the RCRs and the 48th. Now General Simmons was ready to mount his attack on Adjira. Cracked German troops faced the Canadians. For the artillery, it was a dream come true, and they prepared to lay down the heaviest artillery concentration of the entire campaign in preparation for the attack. Every gun let the Germans have it. Sheets of flame flashed over gun positions for half a mile or more. Fighting continued into the next day. The artillery concentration was too much for the Germans. The dried grass was still smoking from the shelling when the infantry attacked. Adjira fell to the Canadians on the 28th of July, 1943. It had been another triumph for the 2nd Brigade, supported by tanks and machine gunners of the Saskatoon Light Infantry. The Canadian 1st Division had won its battle spurs as part of Montgomery's famed 8th Army. As the pipes of the Seaforth Highlanders from Canada's west coast celebrated the victory, the Royal Canadian Engineers cleared the roads of hidden German mines. The Canadians were heading for Regalbuto, one of the key points of the Nazi defense system. Our troops met with cratered roads, roadblocks, blown bridges. The battle-wise Nazis were putting up fierce and skillful resistance at every natural barrier. It was a delaying action.
First, we had to smash the enemy positions in the hills around the town. It took us 3 days. Every house, every street. The Jerrys were covering every window. We went after them with everything we had. In these last weeks, we learned a lot. Grenades, Tommy guns, cold steel. There were a lot of dead Jerrys when our boys were through. Those that were alive were so stunned they couldn't speak. The Nazis were nervous and jumpy. It was hell for them. It wasn't a picnic for us.
Our troops had to pay in sweat and blood. If a Canadian soldier was wounded in action, within seconds an expert medical soldier was at his side. He was rushed to safety by truck, jeep, mule. The more seriously wounded were flown out on a clockwork schedule. The best surgical care, the most delicate major operations were performed with skill and patience, close to the firing line. Medical Corps personnel saved the lives of thousands of Canadian soldiers, men needed for the battles to come. In the central sector, the Canadians pushed on towards Adrano, while the Americans and British were unable to race along the coast roads to Messina, last Axis stronghold, thus completing the conquest of Sicily, ending the first round in the battle for Europe. The first time in this war that British, Canadian, and American troops had combined in a large-scale operation. The first time a major Canadian force had seen action. In 38 days, out of the heat and dust, out of the hard mountain fighting and decisive victories, the Red Patch Devils had emerged soldiers equal to the best. It was the United Nations victory. This was the Axis toll. Thousands of dead, 260 tanks, 500 guns, more than 1,500 planes destroyed and captured, and over 100,000 prisoners of war. The soldier, the worker, the farmer, the people of Canada had won. Here was the key to victory everywhere.